Welcome to our deep dive into the ideas of Noam Chomsky.
hmm
You gave us quite a collection here, interviews, book excerpts, even some critical essays, all kind of circling around his views on language power, the role of
Yeah.
intellectuals.
Yeah.
And we're going to be exploring some of the ways that he sees language being used as a tool and not always for good. So
Right.
get ready for some serious aha moments.
What I find so intriguing about Chomsky is how he always seems to connect his analysis back to history. Like he's constantly invoking George Orwell,
Yeah.
particularly concepts like thought control and historical engineering, almost suggesting that, these things aren't relics of the past.
Yeah, it's like Orwell's dystopian world is playing out in subtle ways right now, and we don't realize it.
And for Chomsky, language is really at the heart of this manipulation. He argues that those in power, they deliberately twist and reshape language to serve their own interests, and it's basically a way of controlling how we perceive reality.
Yeah, that reminds me of something you pointed out in the sources, Chomsky's analysis of how the name of a government department changed from War Department back to Defense Department.
Ah, yes. Such a seemingly minor change. But Chomsky argues that, renaming it the Defense Department was a way to kind of mask the reality of its actions. It becomes much easier to justify military interventions when you frame them as defense rather than outright aggression.
It's almost like putting lipstick on a pig, right? You change the name, but the underlying reality remains the same. And it really makes you think how much of what we accept as truth is simply a carefully crafted narrative.
That's a crucial question, and that leads us directly into one of Chomsky's most well-known concepts, this idea of manufacturing consent. He borrows it from Walter Lippmann, who was a journalist and political commentator who argued that, public opinion is largely shaped by the information that we receive, and that information can be controlled.
So it's not that we're choosing to be ignorant, it's more that we're being fed a carefully curated version of reality.
Precisely. And this is where Chomsky turns his critical eye towards the media. He argues that despite claims of objectivity, the media often function as a tool for manufacturing consent, for promoting views that align with powerful institutions and corporate interests.
That's a pretty bold claim. Does he
Yeah.
give any specific examples of how this actually happens?
Oh, absolutely. He kind of dissects the media's inner workings, pointing out the techniques that are used to marginalize dissenting voices and reinforce the dominant narrative. One that he highlights is limiting access.
Okay.
Think about how experts are often given, mere seconds to make complex points on news channels. That's hardly enough time to present a nuanced argument.
Right. It's all sound bites and quick takes, and you're left feeling like you've gotten the whole story, but really you've just scratched the surface.
Exactly. And then there's the over-reliance on official sources. Chomsky argues that the media often present the perspectives of government officials or corporate spokespeople as the definitive truth without really questioning their motives or potential biases.
It's like they take what those in power say at face value without digging deeper or seeking out, alternative perspectives.
And let's not forget the framing of debates. Chomsky points out that certain viewpoints are often excluded from mainstream discussions entirely. So dissenting voices are effectively silenced before they can even be heard.
You flagged a few of Chomsky's own case studies in the source material, right? Didn't he analyze media coverage of the Vietnam War and conflicts in Central America?
Yes, he uses these historical events to illustrate his points. For example, in his analysis of the media coverage of the Vietnam War, he argues that crucial facts and alternative perspectives were routinely omitted, which led to a really distorted public understanding of the conflict.
It started to feel like we're living in a hall of mirrors. If we can't trust the information we're getting, how can we even begin to form our own opinions?
That's a crucial point. And it's one that Chomsky grapples with throughout his work. If the information we receive is being filtered and manipulated, how do we break free from that control?
It feels like we're being set up for his critique of intellectuals, right? Because if anyone's going to help us break free from this, you'd think it would be them.
You're absolutely right. This is where Chomsky's critique of intellectuals comes into play. He's especially critical of those he calls cultural commissars, these intellectuals who he believes uphold the status quo, even when it means turning a blind eye to injustice.
So he's saying they become part of the problem, but isn't their role to challenge power, to kind of speak truth to authority?
That's precisely what Chomsky argues they should be doing. He believes intellectuals have a moral obligation to use their platform to challenge dominant narratives, expose wrongdoing, and to empower others with knowledge.
Okay, but isn't that what many intellectuals already do? I mean, I'm thinking of folks who write critical articles or who speak out against injustice, who advocate for social change. Isn't that kind of fulfilling that responsibility?
Yeah. That's a fair point. And Chomsky acknowledges that there are many intellectuals who use their position for good, but his criticism is aimed at those who consciously or unconsciously end up serving the interests of power rather than challenging it. He argues that true intellectual work involves rigorous analysis, meticulous documentation, and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom even when it's uncomfortable.
So it's not just about speaking out, it's about backing up your claims with solid evidence and being willing to really push boundaries.
Exactly. And Chomsky is particularly frustrated by what he sees as a double standard. He points out that dissident voices are often held to a much higher standard of proof and scrutiny than those who are defending the status quo. It's as if the burden of proof is always on the outsider to prove their case beyond a shadow of a doubt, while those in power get a free pass.
That's a really interesting observation. It makes me wonder if there's almost like a built-in resistance to challenging power, even within academic circles.
Chomsky definitely seems to think so. And this brings us to one of his more provocative claims, one that you highlight in the sources, this idea that less educated segments of the population might actually be less susceptible to certain forms of propaganda than the educated elite.
Honestly, that one threw me for a loop when I first read it. It seems so counterintuitive. Wouldn't more education lead to greater awareness of these kinds of manipulative tactics?
You'd think so, right? But Chomsky argues that it's precisely because working-class communities have a more direct experience with the realities of power and exploitation that they may be less likely to buy into certain narratives.
So it's lived experience versus theoretical knowledge.
In a way, yes. Think about it. If you're struggling to make ends meet, if you're facing discrimination, if you're seeing firsthand how the system fails to meet your needs, you're less likely to be swayed by rhetoric that contradicts your daily reality.
It's like the propaganda doesn't stick because their reality is a constant reminder of the truth.
Exactly. And Chomsky contrasts this with the experience of the elite, who are often insulated from these realities. Their education, their social networks, their economic interests. All of these factors can contribute to a worldview that actually supports the existing power structures.
Because it benefits them to maintain the status quo.
Precisely. They might be more willing to overlook injustices, to rationalize inequality, or to accept the dominant narrative if it means preserving their own privilege.
Wow, this whole conversation is making me think differently about the relationship between knowledge and power. It's not as simple as more knowledge equals more power, is it?
No, it's much more complex than Chomsky's analysis suggests that knowledge can be used to empower, but it can also be used to control and manipulate. It all depends on whose interests are being served.
So where does that leave us? If we can't rely on the media and even intellectuals can be complicit in upholding the status quo, how do we break free from this web of manipulation?
Chomsky doesn't offer a simple solution, a step-by-step guide to liberation. But his work does point to several key strategies for resistance.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some hope here.
Well, first and foremost, he emphasizes the importance of education and awareness raising. He believes that by understanding how power operates, by learning to identify these propaganda techniques, we can begin to dismantle these systems of control.
So knowledge is a form of power, but it's the kind of power that we need to cultivate in ourselves and in others.
Exactly. And alongside individual awareness, Chomsky also stresses the importance of collective action. He sees social movements as essential for challenging power and creating lasting change.
He's a big believer in the power of the people, so to speak.
Absolutely. He sees grassroots organizing, community building, and solidarity as crucial tools for resistance.
But organizing is tough. It takes time and energy and resources. And it's easy to get discouraged, especially when those in power seem so entrenched. How do we keep going when it feels like such an uphill battle?
That's where Chomsky's emphasis on hope and optimism comes in. He often invokes this analogy of Pascal's wager, arguing that even if we're unsure about the possibility of change, it's still more rational to act as if it is possible.
So we have to choose to believe, even when it's hard.
In a way, yes. Because if we give into cynicism, if we assume that change is impossible, then we become complicit in maintaining the status quo. But if we believe that change is possible, even if we can't guarantee its success, that belief itself becomes a powerful motivator.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we believe it's possible, we're more likely to act, to organize, to resist, And that action itself creates the conditions for change.
That's a great way to put it. And Chomsky backs up this belief in the power of hope with concrete examples. He often points to historical movements like the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement as evidence of the incredible things that people can achieve when they come together and demand a better world.
So it's not just wishful thinking. It's about recognizing the power of collective action and learning from those who've come before us.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, hope is not naive or idealistic. It's a necessary ingredient for creating a more just and equitable world.
It's like fuel for the resistance. It keeps us going when things get tough.
Precisely. And this brings us to another key aspect of Chomsky's vision, his emphasis on nonviolent resistance.
Ah, yes. I remember this coming up in the sources. Wasn't he a very vocal critic of the Vietnam War and a strong advocate for peaceful protest?
Absolutely. Chomsky argues that violence ultimately reinforces the very systems of power it seeks to overthrow. It creates division, it breeds resentment, and it justifies further oppression. Nonviolence, on the other hand, undermines the legitimacy of those in power by exposing their brutality and hypocrisy.
So it's not just about being morally opposed to violence, it's also about recognizing its strategic limitations.
Exactly. Chomsky sees nonviolence as both a moral imperative and a strategic advantage. It allows movements to maintain the moral high ground, to build broader support, and to appeal to the conscience of those who might otherwise be indifferent.
It's almost like he's advocating for strength through vulnerabilities, like you said, almost like a judo move.
Yeah.
You use your opponent's force against them, you expose their weakness by refusing to engage on their terms.
That's a brilliant analogy, and it really gets to the heart of Chomsky's strategic thinking. He believes that nonviolent resistance can be incredibly powerful, especially when you're facing seemingly insurmountable odds.
But hasn't history shown that violence is sometimes necessary to achieve lasting change? I mean, I'm thinking of revolutions, civil wars, movements that literally had to fight for their survival.
Chomsky acknowledges that there are complex historical situations where violence might seem unavoidable, but he argues that even in those cases, nonviolent resistance can play a crucial role in exposing the injustice, in mobilizing support, and ultimately shifting the balance of power.
So even when you're faced with overwhelming force, there's still a place for peaceful resistance.
That seems to be Chomsky's core belief. He sees it as a long game, a persistent effort to kind of chip away at these oppressive structures and to build a more just world one step at a time.
This is all incredibly inspiring, but I have to admit, I'm still wrestling with how to apply these ideas to my own life. I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not an academic. I'm just an average person trying to make sense of the world. What can I do?
Chomsky would likely say that we all have a role to play in resisting manipulation and creating a more just world, regardless of our position or profession. He often points to the countless acts of courage and compassion that are carried out by everyday people, those who speak up against injustice, who support those in need, who work to make their communities a little bit better.
So it's about recognizing that we all have agency, that we can all make a difference in our own way.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that one of the most effective forms of resistance is simply becoming well-informed. Read critically, question assumptions, seek out diverse perspectives. Don't just accept the dominant narrative at face value. Dig deeper, challenge the status quo, and engage in open and honest dialogue with others.
So it sounds like he's calling for a kind of intellectual awakening, a mass movement of critical thinkers who refuse to be manipulated.
I think that's a great way to put it. And he reminds us that this is a process, not a destination. There's always more to learn, more to question, more to challenge.
Yeah. It can feel overwhelming, but also incredibly empowering, If we can break free from these systems of control, if we can start to see the world with clearer eyes, the possibilities for change seem endless.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the essence of Chomsky's message. The reason he keeps writing and speaking and challenging the status quo. He believes in the power of human beings to create a better world. And he urges us to never give up on that possibility.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope is not a luxury. It's a necessity. And it's a call to action for all of us.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a truly eye-opening exploration of Chomsky's ideas, and I feel like I have a whole new set of tools for navigating the complexities of power and language and social change.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we did. And until next time, stay curious.